a scholar can achieve. Dr. Noguera recently received awards from the Center for the Advanced Study of the Behavioral Sciences and from the National Association of Secondary Principals and from the McSilver Institute at NYU for his research and advocacy efforts aimed at fighting poverty. Today he will discuss his new book, Race, Equity, and Education, 60 Years from Brown. This important new work explores the current state of race since Brown versus the Board of Education through the examination of social and educational policies and the impact they have on social progress. He's also got his own musical introduction. Professor Noguera's powerful and timely analysis takes stock of race and education 60 years after this historic Supreme Court decision, and his talk today examines education as one of the most visible markers for racial disparities in the U.S., as well as one of the most visible frontiers for racial justice. So that's the formal introduction, but I will tell you informally that Professor Noguera is a pioneer, and he is a changer of ideas, of people, of systems, and don't be fooled by the intimate audience that we have here today that's gathered to meet him. This is probably the biggest treat you can get, to have this much time with Professor Noguera. So I'm going to invite you please to come up and give your remarks. Be prepared, start writing down your questions now because you'll have plenty. All right, cool.
Good afternoon. And first, let me thank the Bunche Center, Professor Hunt, for having me. I'm really happy to be associated with the center now as a new faculty member. This is kind of my coming out lecture here at UCLA in some ways. My first kind of, well, not really, but almost, a public lecture. And I got nowhere tomorrow, so they're really, I'm really having a lot, but I'm really happy to do this here with the Bunche Center. And I also want to thank Professor Noble, who you probably guess is also a good friend, and along with their husband Otis and her child, my child, a very good friend. So it's good to have friends already here at UCLA. And thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Now, I have to warn you, I did bring a copy of the book. I didn't bring more because I don't even encourage people to buy it. It's $100, okay? Which I think is outrageous, right? And so, you know, the publisher, unfortunately,
it's like a Beyonce ticket.
Sets the price, and even the Kindle version is excessive. But should you choose to make the investment, you can get it online, both through Amazon and through Kindle. Probably Amazon will get cheaper soon. We also, so the project originated out of some discussions we were having while I was still at NYU about kind of the state of race and education in America 60 years after Brown. And our sense was that despite the rhetoric out there about education as a civil rights issue of the 21st century, I'll come back to that in a moment, because we hear that pretty often, what was interesting is there was almost no mention of the Brown decision at 60. It was almost silence from the Obama administration, from the Civil Rights Department within the administration, and that seemed noteworthy, right? That no one would officially say, oh, it's 60 years, where are we, right? Especially when you consider how significant this decision was, not just on issues of race. Because the fact of the matter is that Brown laid the precedent for expanding democratic rights through education for women, right, with the enactment of Title IX, for non-English speakers with Law versus Nichols, and for the disabled with the Americans with Disabilities Act. That is, the premise was that if you give rights to people in education, then that will serve as the basis for extending their rights to other areas, which is what Brown really did, right? Brown brought about the end of apartheid for African Americans, and by extension other minorities, Latinos, Native Americans, Asian Americans. Even though it started in education, it's extended eventually to housing and extended to transportation, extended to everything else. Because once you say you can't do it in the schools, then how do you rationalize doing it in these other sectors? Right? So what's interesting about education is that you can trace the history through which democracy has expanded through education. Because education's often been at the forefront. So we thought that the 60th anniversary would be a good occasion to see where do we stand. And we decided to hold a conference. We decided to invite several prominent individuals who've been working on these issues for many years. We also decided, and one of the things we did with the conference is we did this special issue of Race and Social Problems. And so many of the authors who later then contributed to the book were originally in the journal. Because we thought we want some documentation of the work, but we also want to have some public engagement with it too. On the second day of the conference, we decided we'd have a debate on whether or not we continue to pursue racial integration at all in education. And we featured advocates on both sides, including, it was very interesting to see, we brought Russell Ali, who at the time was Assistant Secretary of Education for Civil Rights, and during the debate she ended up flipping sides. We chose to have young people as the jury, to let them decide, after hearing the arguments, to render a verdict on what we should do, right? And it was interesting because many of the proponents of basically leave it alone were in the charter sector, who was saying basically separate but equal is good enough. Right, it was very telling. And then we had others who say no, the path to equality is still through integrated schools. So it was an interesting debate, and then we closed off with Reverend Jesse Jackson in a conversation with myself about where we stand now. So we decided we needed to go further, and we needed to really at least try to get this discussion going out in public. And so hence the book. The book really looks at what we call increasingly second generation issues. But I do want to at least acknowledge this picture from Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, 1957. President Eisenhower sends federal troops to escort 9 students to school, and they stay with them for a good part of the school year, but to protect them from the violent mobs. Just a poignant reminder of the political capital that was expended to make this possible. This was the first time since the Civil War that federal troops have been deployed for domestic disturbance. And it was done by, again, a Republican president. And the fact that now, after going through all this, there'd be silence on this issue says a lot about where we are. I would say part of the reason for the silence is because there's clear evidence that our schools are increasingly more segregated over the last 30 years. Segregated on the basis of race and class. And what's interesting, the most segregated group in the country now are not African Americans, but Latinos. And for both African Americans and Latinos, it is increasingly the case that they are much more likely to be concentrated in under-resourced schools that do very little in the way of meeting their educational needs. Issue I'll come back to in a moment. The courts have made it more difficult, most recently in the decision by the Roberts Court in Seattle versus and Louisville cases, Parents versus Public Schools, which basically didn't even allow for voluntary integration in those 2 cities. And so the courts have increasingly not been an ally, although they originally were, but neither has the administration. And some people say, well, Obama being a black president didn't want to expend his political capital trying to push this issue. But as Gary Orfield makes clear in this article, there's a lot we could still do to promote more integrated schools that we're not doing, right? And I'll come back to that a little later. The other thing that this is a reminder of, is that civil rights, as we understand in the United States, are always tentative, right? Never permanent. That is, even when you think you you won something, it can be chipped away and taken away, right? And we've seen that with voting rights most recently. We've seen it with affirmative action, and we're about to see it probably soon in this new case involving the University of Texas. We've seen it with the police killing, something as basic as that, the rights of due process, the rights to not to be killed by the police, which I think only has drawn attention because it's been captured on film. Not that this is a new phenomenon, but just that now undeniable because of the evidence that the films create. And then in the case of Flint, we even see something as basic as the right to water not being guaranteed. So it's really important that when we think about civil rights, we don't think that this journey towards democracy is just uniform, right? In fact, it's very uneven. And as the history shows, you can never take these rights for granted. So I want to now look at where we are, and part of what we do in the book is we look at what we call second generation discrimination. And by second generation, what we mean is the forms of discrimination that are increasingly important to look at after Brown. Right? So Brown still is the law of the land officially. No school in America can say we discriminate on the basis of race. That just because they can't say that doesn't mean they don't find ways to limit access, and we can see many examples in which they do. We also know that many schools base enrollment on residential patterns, and since we live in a highly segregated society based on residence, that plays a major role in perpetuating school segregation. But beyond those issues, we're looking at issues of tracking, that is how students are grouped in school, and how that often has the effect of resegregating kids within school. A number of studies showing, for example, African American children least likely to be placed in gifted and talented classes, even when they meet the criteria. And a recent study showing most likely to be placed when they are taught by a black teacher. We're looking at special education, the other side of this, and the over-representation of children of color, particularly boys, who are identified as learning disabled and effectively denied learning opportunities, despite the fact that special education is supposed to guarantee them those rights. We're looking at issues of racial disparities in discipline, and here I think the U.S. Department of Education has played a major role in the release of the report by Kathy Lehman, who some of you may know because she was a civil rights attorney here in Los Angeles until recently, and now heads the office previously headed by Russell and Ali, and they documented children as young as 4 years old, mostly African American, being suspended from school, preschools, and this pattern being a national pattern of kids being denied learning opportunities again, ostensibly because of discipline, school discipline, and again these disparities and disproportionate number of African American, in some cases Latino children being pushed out of school. We're looking also at the curriculum and who's represented, who's not represented, what texts are included, and how history is told. And as some of you know, big case recently in Jefferson County, Colorado, where the elected school board decided to eliminate all kinds of mentions of slavery, all kinds of mentions of civil rights. Fortunately, they were kicked out of office, but the Texas State Board of Education has done similar things in trying to minimize the history of racism in the United States in their way in which history gets portrayed. And so we look at how that is playing out. With this study just recently released from Stanford University showing the impact, the positive impact of ethnic studies in schools that have it on the performance, academic performance of students of color, not just in ethnic studies, but throughout the curriculum. So we thought that looking at how race is included in the curriculum is very important. Looking at who's teaching our kids, why it is. The American Federation of Teachers just released a report showing that it's still the case that 89% of the teachers in the country are white, predominantly female. Why that is, and what are the implications of a largely white teaching force in the country today. School funding, huge issue, because we are one of few countries in the world that deliberately spends the most money on the most affluent children and the least on the poorest children. California has taken a very positive step in beginning to reverse that, with this equity-based funding formula, though of course the basic aid districts like Beverly Hills and Palo Alto somehow are not included and continue to spend considerably more than other districts. But I do have to give California credit for at least acknowledging that money matters, and you have to get more resources to the schools and districts that are most impacted by poverty. And then lastly, we're also looking at what's happening outside of schools. How issues like poverty, trauma, and what we now call toxic stress related to the environment and the poisonous environment in many of our communities is impacting children and their well-being. These are not your typical educational issues. They certainly weren't the germane issues that the Supreme Court was grappling with in 1954, but in communities across the country, these are the kinds of issues where race and education are most continuously implicated and where communities are grappling with what to do now. And so again, the book was designed to try to illuminate some of this. Poverty is by far the biggest issue. If you were to disaggregate the performance of school districts across the country, you would see that districts with 25% less poverty in the district are among the top performing schools in the world. If you don't control for poverty, and you should know that within public schools in the United States, 50% of children qualify for free or reduced lunch, because we have the highest child poverty rates of all advanced nations. Right? The United States ranking amongst countries goes down considerably in reading, math, science, etc. Okay, so poverty is an educational issue. The irony of that is that the ESEA, the Elementary Secondary Education Act, which was just reauthorized by the Obama administration and Congress as the Every Child Succeeds Act, they renamed it from No Child Left Behind, was originally conceived by the Johnson administration when it was enacted in 1965 as an anti-poverty measure. Because it was understood that given the inequities in school funding and given the impact of poverty, you had to give more resources to schools that were serving poor children. Interestingly, Lyndon Johnson was himself formerly a teacher, right, who taught poor children on the border of Mexico. So I'm sure some of that had some impact on his thinking, but we were in the middle of a war on poverty, and the record shows that when the country was most committed to addressing these inequities, both in school and outside of school, and when the country was committed to integration, the greatest progress in reducing academic disparities was made. So if you look at the data shows that the gaps in reading and math and all these other performances actually closed between black and white children, particularly because those were the main categories that they were looking at, up until 1980. And then there's stagnation. And we've been in a state of stagnation almost ever since, despite all the rhetoric of No Child Behind. And I would say it's largely, and I can give you some articles and looking at it further, because we're doing so little to address the conditions under which children learn and the conditions they live in outside of school. So, as we all know, inequality is growing in the United States. Anybody who follows Bernie Sanders knows, but you don't have to follow Bernie Sanders, follow the Pope. Pope is acknowledged. It's a global issue, and it helps to have a Nobel Prize winning economist say, yeah. He says, the United States has become the most unequal country amongst advanced industrial countries. We have less opportunity than not only all of Europe, but of any advanced industrial countries for which there's data. And what this means is very simple. The life chances of an individual are more dependent on the income and education of their parents than in other countries. And then the implication of this is that people born at the bottom, who unfortunately choose their parents, he's being sarcastic there, don't choose their parents, who are poor and not well educated, will be more likely not to be able to live up to their potential. What that means in simple English is that rather than schools serving as the pathway to opportunity, what the data shows is that schools are reproducing patterns of inequality. That's the implication of the achievement gap. The achievement gap that we claim to be so fixated on is nothing more than an educational manifestation of inequality. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The problem is that in this country, we expect schools to solve their problem by themselves. And we have ample evidence it doesn't work. In fact, all the data shows that wherever poverty is concentrated, schools are failing. Schools are not performing. And we're still not addressing this as a broader policy issue. Instead, what we do is we blame the schools. So here's a quote that also very telling. In the debate over how to fix American public education, many believe that schools alone cannot overcome the impact that economic disadvantage has on a child. That life outcomes are fixed by poverty and family circumstances, and that education doesn't work until other problems are solved. This theory is in some ways comforting for the educators. These must be some sick educators we have up there, and they're comforted by that. The problem is the theory is wrong. It's hard to know how wrong because we haven't yet tried to make the change that would tell us, but plenty of evidence demonstrates that schools can make an enormous difference despite the challenges presented by poverty and family background. Okay, this was a Washington Post editorial, but I want you to look at the authors of the editorial. It's not only Joel Klein, who was formerly the chancellor of New York City Public Schools, who in many ways became the spokesperson for a particular kind of reform, but it included Janet Murguia from the National Council de la Raza, and Michael Lomax from the National Council, United Negro College Fund. Right? So what's important about this is the so-called civil rights organizations have lined up with many political figures, both Republican and Democratic Party, and many major foundations, including Gates Foundation, Broad Foundation locally, in asserting that poverty is not the issue. The issue is school accountability, educator accountability, and that, I would say, has been the focus of our policies for the last 15 years. And not surprisingly, we're not seeing much change. Again, what we know now is the disparities in educational outcomes mirror other disparities. Disparities in wealth, in income, in home ownership, in employment, in health, in life expectancy, disease, infant mortality, in the criminal justice system, and again in education. And just, I was just speaking at a conference held in a medical school on disparities, and I made this point, and they get it in public health, that they understand these connections. Somehow in education, we have a kind of tunnel vision. That's the reason why the courts could actually rule, right, that we need race-neutral policies in college admissions and ignore the fact that nothing else is race-neutral. That is, that we don't have equal preschools or equal public schools. We have fundamentally unequal schools. But somehow that's not part of the conversation when we talk about affirmative action. This is just to show you the trends in wealth, right? And very important to make the distinction between wealth and income in the United States over the last few years, and it's actually gotten worse. And it's also mirrored in graduation rates. And if I were to put up health data, you see similar patterns. So the point being that the patterns, the correspondence between the disparities in education and the disparities in wealth and income are important to note, because you can't pretend that they don't have an impact on learning outcomes. The Educational Testing Service is known for many years now, since the Coleman Report of 1966, the strongest predictor for how well a child will do in school, for how well they'll do on the SAT, is family income. Family income combined with parental education, particularly the education of the mother, is the driver of student outcomes. Which again reinforces the idea that what's happening in our schools is we're reinforcing inequity, not disrupting it through education. Although that occasionally happens, we'll come back to that too. So just again, 40% of public schools don't offer preschool. Despite, this is shocking in some ways. Every other advanced industrialized country offers free preschool to all children. Not here. Now there are many cities that are moving in that direction, but I would even point out, a city like New York, which now claims they have universal preschool, does not have equal preschool. The preschool for the poor does not like the preschool for the middle class, and the preschools are segregated on the basis of race and class, an issue that even a progressive mayor like Mayor de Blasio does not address. Secondly, you have limited access to AP advanced placement courses for African American, Latino, and Native American students. We know how important those are, particularly in a place like UCLA for admissions, right? Also saves money for parents who are sending kids to college. We know that poor kids, read a recent study by Linda Darling-Hammond, less access to highly qualified teachers. That is, teachers who have degrees in the subjects they teach. And then we still have these wide disparities in funding. So all these pertain to what I would call gaps in opportunity. We focus a lot on achievement gaps. We don't focus on the gaps in opportunities, the opportunity to learn. So the question that many of the authors and myself have posed is, can we make more progress in education without addressing poverty and inequality? That is it realistic? And if so, what would it look like to do so? And secondly, what policies and practices might move us forward? Since it doesn't look like we're going to be in a war on poverty anytime soon. We'll be in a war on the poor, but not a war against poverty. So, several research scientists, policymakers, myself included, have issued a policy statement. You can see a reissue of it next week, called A Broader, Bolder Approach, advocating that we take a more holistic approach to the way we think about education, the way we think about supporting children and communities, that we focus on the non-academic needs, the social, the health needs of children, as well as the academic needs. We have to do the both, right? And the fact is, we have examples of these schools that do it, right? That we call community schools, that bring in services. UCLA runs a school like that in Pico Union right now. Right? Problem is, we don't have enough of them. The best known example is in Harlem right now, Harlem Children's Zone. And many people celebrate it. In fact, many people say that President Obama was so influenced by it, it influenced the development of the Promised Neighborhood Initiative because he wanted to do more of it. The problem is that Jeff Canada has a pipeline to Wall Street, He's raised over $170 million to support the effort, to support 6,000 children in Central Harlem, provide health services, preschool, comprehensive supports to those 6,000 children. Very hard to replicate in other communities that don't have access to those kinds of private resources. Nonetheless, we do have models, and the models, like the Children's Aid Society, we have models like this in Los Angeles. What's your name again? Dawn's father was the champion of the model, James Comer at Yale. He's been advocating these kinds of supports for schools, and at one time in this country, it was extremely popular. We were talking earlier about how influential her father was in the 1980s and 1990s, and suddenly it stopped. Not because the needs went away, but because education policy is so faddish. And so as we entered the 2000 and the Bush administration came in, we got this singular focus on achievement. And I should add here, it's not just the Bush administration, because No Child Behind was bipartisan, came from Ted Kennedy in the Senate and George Miller in the House, working with the Bush administration to give it. And the irony is that the term, leave no child behind, did not come from the Bush administration. It came from the Children's Defense Fund and Marian Wright Edelman. But when they advocated leave no child behind, they meant focus on health, nutrition, and all the other things kids need. That's not policy now. And so when we hear, and we've heard, that education is a civil rights issue of the 21st century, we've heard it from President Obama. On many occasions, we hear it from Joel Klein, Mike Bloomberg, a number of public officials, Arnie Duncan. They never talk about those other needs that children have. Right? They really are only focusing narrowly on achievement as measured by student test scores. And that, I think, is a big part of why we're not making more progress. We do have examples of places that are making progress. And so the real question is, why aren't we doing more of what clearly seems to be working? So in the Bay Area, there's a partnership, which I actually helped play a role in starting, between 7 East Bay high schools, 2 community colleges, 1 university, Cal State Hayward, and 5 biotech firms. It's now 25 years old. Students get training, which means 4 years of science, 4 years of math, to go into jobs earning $16 an hour in biotech, which are not just entry-level jobs, because if they continue to pursue their education in community college or the university, they can have a career pathway. The other thing is, though, if they choose they don't want to do biotech when they graduate, they have 4 years of science, 4 years of math. They have completed all the requirements they need to apply to college. So unlike the old vocation, where it was, some people are going to do manual labor and some people do a college material, the new career tech expands options for kids rather than limiting them. And this Biotech Academy is a good example. There are other promising models like that. In Newark, there's a renewable energy project where kids are learning not only about renewable energy, but also developing skills on how to do solar heating. There's a small business incubator project in Providence, Rhode Island, where kids are literally launching businesses while they're in school. They have meetings with venture capitalists to get funding, and extremely promising for kids who want to work for themselves and establish their own businesses. Medical sciences program in the Bronx, kids learn the skills they need while they're in high school to become an EMT specialist and graduate, walk into jobs making $45,000 at 18. And then there's Year Up. Year Up is a partnership, all private sector, trains 18 to 25-year-olds with only a high school diploma or GED, and 6 months of training leads to jobs making $40,000 to $50,000 a year in finance and high tech. So we have a small number of examples that you can start to use education to at least create access to better paying jobs. But again, these programs are limited. They're not nearly enough given the vast need. The New York Times did a study, it wasn't actually from the Times, but the Times reported on it, on disconnected youth, the large number of missing, particularly African American males, who are neither in school, neither in the workforce, and are disconnected, as I said. And many of these males are the people who are in and out of the criminal justice system and are totally cut off from the opportunities in society. Right? And we need more models, not just at the high school level, but at the community college level, that are reconnecting. And Michael Stoll, a colleague here in public policy, has been working on that. In addition, there's a growing call amongst educators to shift the focus away from high-stakes testing, away from a standards-based curriculum which emphasizes coverage of material but no focus on actual performance. And to focus instead on motivation and engagement in schools. And what's interesting about the schools that have done it, there are 36 schools in New York State that are now called performance assessment schools. That is where students work on projects with teachers, they produce a product, it could be a research paper, it could be other kinds of projects that they work on over the course of a year with the teacher. Students who go to these schools have much higher college attendance rates, much greater persistence than students who come from traditional schools. Across the country, we have a huge problem with kids who pass state exams are still required to go to remedial courses in college because the exams don't actually prepare them for college level work. Sacramento areas, they discovered, and they're not the only ones, but they're doing extremely well, that you can use spoken word, you can use hip hop as a way to promote literacy. Get kids writing, get kids reading. And they are now not only doing workshops for young people, but doing workshops for teachers on how to use literacy through spoken word as a way to enhance the literacy skills of kids. So we have examples across the country that are demonstrating that you can in fact begin to change outcomes if you focus the lens of education on something other than high-stakes testing and accountability. Actually look at how to engage young people in the educational process. I included this because one of the things that the research has been very clear about for many years is the importance of parents. The importance of involving parents as partners. James Coleman again did research trying to understand why parochial schools that serve similar kids get better results than public schools. And his finding was about trust between parents and schools. That is, this sense of trust leads to reinforcement at home amongst parents for what is important about education. As elusive as that might seem, I saw evidence of it in the Eastern Cape in South Africa, outside of Port Elizabeth, where at this particular school in the township where 80% of the people are unemployed, high poverty rates, high rate of HIV, and very high rate of orphans, because children who've lost their parents. This is a school where over 100 parents volunteer each day to staff the school, don't get paid, run a garden, run a clinic, provide security, do all these things. And I kept asking, and the principals in the back there, I kept asking them, why do you do it? He said, well, they said, well, our kids are here. And the other said, well, we weren't working anyway, so we had time on our hands. And the principal kept insisting, I work for them, not for the Ministry of Education. In fact, the Ministry of Education had not paid their teachers for several months, and the parents waged a protest to the ministry. And he was in it. I said, in the United States, you would never see a principal marching with parents to make demands from the government. And he said, listen, if I don't march with them, they'll be marching against me. So I'd rather be with them than against them. So I bring this up because I think parents are often an overlooked resource in many communities. We don't think of parents as a resource that can help schools, even though the research about the importance of parents is very clear and consistent. That is that what parents do to support children always has an impact on outcomes. It also has an impact on schools. When parents are more engaged, schools are more accountable to the parents and children they serve. Finally, we have lots of examples that are focused on resilience. It's the other side of focus of addressing trauma. Just a study released, if you read the New York Times Sunday, see a study done about Oakland Public Schools and the African American Male Initiative, where they're really focusing on building up young people, dressing self-esteem, dressing connection to school and learning, and getting amazing results. Improving attendance, grades, reducing discipline patterns. What blew me away, because I was very suspicious of the initiative initially, because they really just hired one person to do the work for the whole district, is how much they've done with so little. Right? And I attribute it largely to the efforts of this Chris Chapman, the person leading the initiative, that they've been able to accomplish so much. The unfortunate thing about it is I think other districts will look at it and think we could also do a lot with very little, and not hold principals accountable for what they're doing to meet the needs of the students they serve. So all of this points to, and all of the chapters in the book reinforce the fact that we need new policies that link education to other needs. We need a more holistic approach to thinking about how to support kids. We need to ensure that kids have expanded and enriched learning opportunities, both in school, after school, summer school. Right? That's what middle class kids get. There is an 8,000 hour gap between middle class kids and poor kids in learning time. And that learning time is made up in after school and summer. And it has a huge effect. And so we need to look at how do we close those gaps. How do we ensure access to quality early childhood education? How can we coordinate other services to schools that need social workers and psychologists, because otherwise you're expecting teachers to address needs that they're not qualified to address in the first place. And we need to shift the focus of policy, education policy, away from this narrow focus on accountability and pressure. Right? Think about this. In New Jersey, just the state of New Jersey, every urban district in the state of New Jersey is under state control. Every urban district, with the exception of Elizabeth. And when is the last time you heard Governor Christie say, my schools aren't doing too well? That is, we have an accountability system that holds those with the most power the least accountable. No accountability on top. All the accountability on the kids and their teachers. And not surprising, it doesn't work. So the alternative is to focus on capacity building. And incidentally, the city in North America that's made the greatest gains in meeting the needs of kids has a capacity building focus, and that city is Toronto. And not surprisingly, Toronto, like the rest of Canada, outperforms the United States on every measure, because there is universal preschool, there is our support systems for children and families, and when the school is not doing well, they don't get pressure, they don't get scrutiny, they get help. They get help from the ministry, comes in and says, how can we support you in doing a better job of meeting the needs of kids? So it's a different emphasis. You can look on their website, point out to people, Toronto did that with a crack-smoking mayor. Right? So imagine what could be possible if you sobered up, right? The key thing to keep in mind is that the country's changing. It's already changed, right? The majority of children in the country are children of color already. And whites will no longer be the majority of the country as a whole by more or less 2044. What I often try to remind people, because some people look at that, and especially when people get scared, and I would say, no, but white people, especially old white people, think about retiring, should become the strongest advocates for public education. Because what this means is that increasingly it will be Black and Latino kids who will be supporting them in their retirement. Because that's how the system works. It's the current workers who support the present white retirees, and most of those retirees are white. Right? So it's our interdependence that we have to understand as we think through, okay, how do we begin to address these very difficult and seemingly intractable issues that I would say many of our policymakers have largely ignored. Again, I'm largely a fan and supporter of President Obama in many areas, but not in education, because the policies pursued under this administration are almost identical to those pursued under the previous administration, and not surprisingly, we haven't seen much in the way of progress. And so, I would say, regardless of who's the next president, we're going to need a shift if we want to see a change in outcomes. So I'll stop there and open it up for your questions. Thank you.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes, so let's open it up. I see some hands already. Yes.
How you doing, Professor Noguera?
Yes.
My name is Jonathan. I'm a PhD candidate in the political science department, and I've been a major fan of your work for a while.
Oh, thank you.
I read a chapter you wrote on social capital, a case study you did up in the Bay, and it was amazing. My work is along similar lines. I'm interested in the role of democracy in public schooling. So I just kind of wanted you to talk more about that and teasing out the models. You kind of sort of suggested that there would be community input. How much of this is kind of like actual like sort of democratic input, a role in making policy at the local level? Is there room for that in some of these models? Is that something that takes place? And if so, is that something that you find beneficial to these models toward the success of these types of things?
So really good question, because I would say right now, in almost every city, almost every community across the country, we have a dual system of education. A private one for the affluent and a public one for the poor. And even within the public one, We'll have some exceptions of magnet schools or programs that will serve a more affluent population, and while the poorest kids are in some other situation. I wrote an article recently about the Broad proposal in Los Angeles, which is calling for 50% of schools in Los Angeles be chartered. And I'm not against charter schools, but the concern I have is about public accountability and democracy. Who runs them? Who are they accountable to? We don't even know how they're funded. We have a lot of clear evidence in many states of misuse of public funds, very little transparency with respect to how public funds are being used in many of those schools. So to me, that's a huge concern about parent rights, student rights in those schools. We have a lot of evidence of kids being pushed out who are found to be more difficult to serve. So the question of democracy is, I think, critical. I was just in Atlanta yesterday, but I would say the thing about, say, Los Angeles. In most of our cities, we are more likely to invest money in football teams and football stadiums than in schools. Think about the celebrations over the Rams here. And I was in Atlanta yesterday, where my former student is the superintendent. I mean, and here, you have a city with great wealth like Los Angeles that consistently does not support its public schools. And I don't want to downplay the importance of charity, because there is a lot of philanthropy in the schools, but it doesn't begin to address the critical needs. It's estimated a school, like one of the schools we're thinking about partnering with at the School of Education here, Griffith Joyner in South LA, over 30% of kids have experienced trauma, right? A significant trauma. This is a school that needs a number of resources in order for it to begin to meet those needs. We should not have to rely on philanthropy to address that. That should be a matter of the public and the democratic process to figure out how do we get resources to the communities with the greatest need, but it's not. I've called out Mayor Garcetti several times on this issue because he's been silent. This whole debate, it's as though he doesn't understand that schools are a vital part of the social infrastructure. He's more focused on the Olympics that won't even happen when he's mayor than he is on the state of the schools. But he's not alone. I say you see that in many cities. Now here's the contrast. Tulsa, Oklahoma. Right? And ironically, Tulsa, in a very red city with a very red city, every school in Tulsa is a community school. Tulsa's had universal preschool for over 20 years. The best school in Tulsa is 50% African American. Booker T. Washington, strong commitment to integrated schools in Tulsa. I was given a tour of their community schools work, and the Greenwood neighborhood. Greenwood is important because that was the neighborhood that was burned. The black community was burned in 1924 during the riots, the white riots against the black community. And he took me to the site where John Hope Franklin had been calling for reparations for many years. And there's a statue of Franklin there. And he said, I took you here because I want you to know we didn't get reparations, but we're still trying to make it right. This was a white Republican former police officer who serves on the city council. Talk about reparations. And my head's spinning, right? So, and the leader of the effort to build these support systems in schools is the wife of the Republican mayor. So, this is Tulsa. If it happened in Tulsa, why not LA?
Thank you for sharing your information. I have a question. If our schools are resource challenged, which they are, what strategies are we able to use to actually do capacity building with the lack of resources?
So, one of the slides I put up, I might have, okay, come back. The reason why I put this one up, this is the township in South Africa, outside of Port Elizabeth. They've realized they don't have to wait for the government to do the capacity building work. They're focused on parents and community. And so, and I mean, again, what was impressive about this school is it's thriving. It's a thriving, high-functioning school that's gotten no more money from the government. Right? In fact, they continue to protest the government for lack of support. But they're not waiting for the government to help them. Right? They are taking initiative to basically, through human capital, right, and the social capital of the community, to support the school. So I would say we need to do both. We need to both fight for different policies, as I call for, but at the same time, not wait until the policies are in place to support our kids.
Okay, and I do understand that. I guess, let me go further in depth with my question. There has to be some point of organization that is developed that allows that to happen. Okay, so in that way, how are they being organized, and is there a way for us to model that here?
So in the case of this school, it was the principal who led the organization. He went out he gets assigned to the school, it's non-functioning, and so he says, the only way this school's gonna work is if I get this community involved. So he proceeds to work to get community involvement. In the case of Oakland, this African-American male initiative, they hired one person, Chris Chapman, a young man, and said, you're going to lead the effort to improve outcomes for African-American males. So he comes to see me, so what should I do? I said, you're set up, man. One guy can't do this. And I tell him, you need to not take this job. Well, he takes the job anyway. And he proceeds to call on mentors and gets mentors in schools. So it's largely through a lot of voluntary effort, but they're having a huge impact. So I never want to suggest that that can make up for policy and resources. But I do want to say there's a lot we could do even while we're waiting. And we should. Right? I mean, think about the Black Panther Party and what they were able to do without resources, right, in many communities. Here and then get Professor.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm in the Urban Schooling Division at UCLA, and my research focuses on socio-emotional learning as an important component of addressing trauma and toxic stress in schools. My name is Sarah, by the way. So there is a growing movement, particularly within urban schools, to bring yoga and meditation into schools. And these are practices which have been shown time and time again to increase academic performance and to increase resilience, decrease violence, increase pro-social behavior. But what we're seeing is in the opportunity gap, it is mostly still white, affluent schools who are being the recipient of the millions of dollars that are being poured into this on the research side from NIH, and then also you have, cities such as San Francisco, which are incorporating it, attempting to incorporate it throughout the entire city at large. So now we have a mechanism, if you will, for decreasing the academic and opportunity gaps that works, that's being held back from students of color. Do you have anything, have you looked into this whatsoever?
Yeah, I have. And there are a number of schools. In fact, the school that started it in San Francisco, Visitation Valley Middle School, is actually the poorest, one of the poorest, it's in the projects over there in Vis Valley, right? So I would say that there are lots of examples where it is in high poverty schools serving children of color. New Haven has embraced it too. But it's not widely big share. And I think it's because there's a lack of, the federal government has not embraced it, state governments have not embraced it, the research documenting its impact has not been supported, and therefore, so there's really a dearth of research. And there's also some pushback of people who think meditation is prayer, right? And somehow we're going to promote Buddhism in schools, and so there is some resistance. What Visitation Valley started out with, they call it meditation, they call it quiet time, right? And that was more palatable than a mantra, right? So I think you're absolutely right. It is a promising area. I would still say, as promising as it may be, and my wife teaches meditation here on campus. That we should not see. One of the problems in education, we tend to think there's a panacea, right? And there is no panacea. It's not like we just get those kids meditating and voila, the score is going to rise. It still comes down to, can you get well-trained teachers? Can you get parents involved? Can you get good facilities and resources? So we don't want to lose sight of those important issues, even as we explore things like meditation and other things that will be beneficial. So I'd say it's that plus, right, that we need.
Yeah, I really appreciate your inequality frame. Because Lord knows, we have lots of inequality, and here in LA, we're talking about this mammoth school system, LA USD, that is highly segregated, predominantly Latino, African American, huge dropout rates, the whole bit. Given the inequality that's here, and given all the challenges associated with that, what do you see as the other obstacles kind of in the way of instituting some type of reform that would actually kind of move the football on the field a bit, as opposed to kind of all the stagnation and the treading of water that I guess we've really seen in recent years?
I would say a lot of the most significant obstacles are political, right? It's the absence of political leadership. We need somebody who is prominent to be the champion for the schools. Right? Now, I think the superintendent will play that role. The question is, will she get the support she needs from the private sector, which is where the money is, right? And it's a shame that the mayor doesn't join her in that effort, because she could use help. But we have the means. I mean, LA is a place with vast wealth, right? So the resources are here. UCLA hopefully is going to do more of its part to support the schools, but we need a lot other players involved to do it. It's such a heavy lift we're asking the schools to pull up by themselves, and not surprisingly, most of them are failing at it. And all you have to do is go into the schools, and but we live in a country where we blame the schools for their failures, rather than saying, look at how we set the schools up to fail. Right? And many schools, I would say, were set up to fail. So I would say it's getting that political problem addressed that would lead to the breakthrough. And I think Tulsa's an example of it. And it's not to say Tulsa is like this beacon of hope, but it's got so many more elements that are working in Tulsa that we don't have in a place like LA. Okay, I'll let you go. I'm sorry.
All right. How about Kara? And then let's do quickly, and we might be able to get you all three before noon.
It's a quick question. I'm sorry I missed the beginning of your talk, so I don't know if it was already addressed, but I was thinking about the role between philanthrocapitalism and charter schools, and how that's possibly a way of deflecting federal attention and state attention from resourcing public schools. So I wanted to know what you think in terms of like what you presented in the opportunity gap, and how they might point to, oh, well, charter schools can do it.
Right, and as we know, federal government, particularly Obama's administration, has been a big advocate and proponent of charter schools. And they point to places like New Orleans, which are now all charter, and DC, where almost half the schools are in charter, and Detroit, as examples. And what those examples also reveal is that charters often exacerbate inequality, right? Because they're not, in many cases, not serving, not all cases, I want to be clear. I can name schools, charter schools, that are serving some of the most disadvantaged kids, including foster care kids. But those are exceptions. I would say that many of the best charters, so you go to High Tech High in San Diego, which often is pointed to, they don't look, the population served at High Tech High doesn't look anything like the San Diego public schools. Right? And that's where the lack of public accountability on charters is really critical. We have many cases of misuse of public funds, of kids being pushed out, and there's been very little scrutiny, public scrutiny on it. Now, the state of Washington just ruled that there could be no charters because of the private use of public funds. The courts have ruled, but that's not the case in most other states right now. And so I'd say that's going to be an issue. We're going to continue to see that divides many communities because of this, the effects that has. Now, the other side of it we have to keep in mind is when parents are desperately looking for a good school, they're the ones lining up to get their kids in the charter schools. And so what we have to be careful about is not pitting parents against each other, as we've seen in many cities. Because I know, how many of you know parents who got their kids in charter schools right now? That happened, right? So we really have to address it as a policy issue and not villainize the parents, right? And really understand what are the political motives behind this movement and address those.
Okay, so see you? Yeah.
Hi, Dr. My name is Jovan. I'm an undergraduate here. So I've benefited a lot from online education, and I know that over the next few decades, that's probably where a lot of education is going to go. Have you looked at how much that will impact the achievement gap, the education gap?
I haven't personally. That's not been a focus of my study, although I'm really concerned about it. I see it as certainly a real benefit, particularly in rural areas where it's hard for people to get access to colleges and universities, particularly adults. So I don't want to by any means suggest that it's all negative, and I do think that there's a lot of things that can be done online that can supplement and reinforce. But what worries me is I'm seeing a number of schools now that in the name of credit recovery have kids online basically studying by themselves, and miraculously within 6 months they've made up 4 years of high school. And I don't believe it's true. I believe that they're not really getting their educational needs met, but they are boosting the numbers. And that's the reason why a number of studies have recently raised questions about the rising graduation rates across the country. And a lot of it points to some fraud in the online initiative. So I don't want to suggest that we shouldn't do online. The question is how, for whom, and how do we ensure that there's some accountability in these online offerings.
Okay, last question here.
Sorry. So I was interested in your idea about, I guess, like changing vocational schools from the vocational schools of old. And I guess I'm just curious, if we're talking about urban schools where you have these like economic centers, why wouldn't businesses see that as like a good avenue to go with their schools and partner up to do that? Because it would seem to fulfill the workforce and create college opportunity.
Well, that's an example of where leadership's needed. You know, it doesn't just happen, right? You know, I just heard a report. The aeronautical industry here in LA, which was a major employer, its workforce is aging out. And they don't know where they're going to get the next generation of engineers and mechanics to do the work in that industry. Those are good paying jobs. And there are very few schools in Los Angeles right now that are preparing young people for work in that industry. So you need strategic thinking, and that needs to come from someplace, right? Mayor's office, somebody needs to be thinking, where are the opportunities to create those pipelines to jobs that are high paying jobs for young people? And because by itself, it doesn't just happen. The example I gave of the East Bay Biotech Consortium, interesting, I worked as the chief of staff to the mayor of Berkeley while I was in grad school. And I knew that the biotech corporation Bayer, that produces Bayer aspirin, was trying to expand, was negotiating with the city for the right to expand. And then I approached them, the CEO, and said, why don't you build an academy for kids? Right? And he said, well, it makes perfect sense to us because in Germany, that's what they do. They use technical preparation to get young people into fields, technical fields like biotech. And from there, it just took off. And now it's got, as I said, 5 other biotech companies involved. And kids are walking out of high school into good paying jobs. And you know, the thing about it, if we would have had more undergraduates here, I would ask, how many of you are working while you're in school? Right? And I'll bet you, there's one back there raising a hand. I mean, so we got to get away from this idea of what's college or work. Guess what? A lot of students in college have to work to support themselves. But many of them don't have any skills, so they can't, all they can get is low wage jobs. Right? Imagine if they could get higher paying jobs to support themselves so they didn't have to live in poverty while they were in school. So this to me, but it doesn't just happen. We do need some strategic partnerships to foster it.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Professor Noguera. There are some flyers on the table for future events coming to you. Please grab one on your way out.
Thank you. And also, we're very fortunate. Focus Features has approached us about the movie Race, about Jesse Owens, which they're going to do it. They're providing us with flyers for you to take. And also, if you look at our website tomorrow, there'll be a link where you can go to a free screening of the movie on the 17th. So we hope that you'll come back to future events and that you'll go see the screening.